The scream pierced the mountain's silence like a gunshot, and Isaac Whitmore was moving before his mind fully registered what he had heard. His massive frame moved through the dense Colorado wilderness with surprising quietness for a man of his size, broad shoulders parting the low-hanging pine branches as his long dark hair whipped behind him. The year was 1873, and these mountains had been his home for nearly 5 years now, ever since he had left civilization behind after the war. He knew every rock, every creek, every animal trail in these parts, but he did not recognize that voice, high and frightened and distinctly female. He burst through a thicket of aspens and stopped cold. There, tangled in the most vicious patch of wild rose thorns he had ever seen, was a woman in a faded calico dress. Blood streaked down her bare arms where the thorns had torn into her flesh, and her bonnet hung askew, revealing copper-colored hair that caught the afternoon sunlight. She was bent at an awkward angle, trapped so thoroughly that every movement only seemed to drive the thorns deeper into her skin and clothing. "Do not move," Isaac said, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke to anyone out here in the mountains. She gasped and twisted toward him, which only made her situation worse. Her eyes went wide at the sight of him, and he could not blame her. He knew what he looked like after years in the wilderness, all muscle and weathered skin, standing well over 6 feet tall with a thick beard and clothes made from buckskin and fur. He probably looked more animal than man to someone from civilization. "Please," she whispered, and he could hear the pain in her voice. "I cannot get free." Isaac approached slowly, assessing the situation with the same careful attention he would give to freeing a trapped animal. The wild roses had grown into a nightmarish tangle here, their canes thick as his thumb and covered in curved thorns that hooked into anything they touched. She had apparently been reaching for blackberries that grew just beyond the rose thicket when she had somehow stumbled or been pulled into the thorns themselves. "This is going to hurt," he said honestly. "But I need you to stay absolutely still. Can you do that?" She nodded, biting her lower lip. Up close, he could see that she was young, probably in her early 20s, with a fine-boned face and green eyes that reminded him of new aspen leaves in spring. Blood welled up from a dozen scratches on her arms and hands, and he could see more tears in her dress where the thorns had penetrated the fabric. Isaac pulled the hunting knife from his belt, and she flinched. "I am going to cut away the thorns," he explained. "Not you." He worked with methodical patience, severing the rose canes one by one, carefully lifting each thorny branch away from her body. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy, and he found himself hyper-aware of every time his fingers brushed against her arm or shoulder. She smelled like lavender soap and berry juice, a stark contrast to the pine and wood smoke that clung to everything in his world. "What is your name?" he asked, partly to distract her from the pain and partly because he genuinely wanted to know. "Eleanor," she said through gritted teeth. "Eleanor Everett. My family and I came through Eureka, California last year on our way to the mining camps. My father thought he would strike it rich in the mountains." "Did he?" Isaac cut away another branch, trying to ignore the way she trembled. "He found enough to keep us fed," Eleanor said. "We have a cabin about 3 miles that way, I think." She tried to gesture but winced as the movement pulled against the remaining thorns. "I got turned around looking for the berry patches. My mother makes preserves, and I wanted to surprise her. These mountains have a way of confusing people," Isaac said. He had cut away most of the larger canes now, but the smaller thorns were embedded in her dress and skin. "I am going to have to pull some of these out. It would be easier if I could see what I am doing." Eleanor's cheeks flushed pink. "I understand." Isaac tried to remain clinical as he gently pushed aside the torn sleeve of her dress, exposing her forearm where at least 20 small thorns had embedded themselves. He worked each one free with careful precision, aware of her sharp intakes of breath, but also of the way she refused to cry out. She had courage, this Eleanor Everett. "You live out here alone?" she asked as he moved to her other arm. "Yes." "Is not that lonely?" Isaac paused, considering the question. "I got used to being alone during the war. After what I saw, after what I did, the silence seemed like a blessing rather than a curse." "What did you do in the war?" "Things I would rather not speak about to a lady," he said quietly. He pulled the last thorn from her arm and moved to examine her dress, which was caught in dozens of places. "I am going to have to cut you free of this in some places. Your dress will be damaged." "Better the dress than me," Eleanor said with a shaky laugh. "I can mend fabric." He used his knife to slice through the portions of her skirt that were too thoroughly tangled to save, trying not to think about the fact that he was essentially cutting her clothing off her body. When the last piece of fabric fell away, he carefully lifted her free of the thorn patch and set her on her feet on solid ground. She swayed, and he steadied her with one hand on her elbow. "Thank you," Eleanor said, looking up at him. "I thought I was going to be trapped there until nightfall, and I have heard the mountain lions in the evening." "You should not be out here alone," Isaac said, more gruffly than he intended. "These mountains are dangerous." "I can see that," Eleanor replied, looking ruefully at her torn and bloody arms. "I thought I knew where I was going. The berry patch I usually visit is picked clean, and I heard there was a better one deeper in the woods. I should have paid more attention to landmarks." Isaac looked at the thorns that had trapped her, then at the blackberry bushes beyond, heavy with ripe fruit. An idea was forming in his mind, unexpected and strange after so many years of solitude. "Where is your cabin?" "North and west of here, I think, near the creek that runs down from the high peaks." Isaac knew the area. There was a small mining claim there, barely enough to support a family, but enough to give them hope. He had seen smoke from their chimney on cold mornings, but had never approached. People meant complications, and complications were what he had fled to these mountains to escape. "I will take you home," he said. "It will be dark soon, and you need to clean those cuts before they fester." Eleanor nodded gratefully, and Isaac led the way through the forest, moving slowly so she could keep up. He noticed that she was limping and realized that thorns must have penetrated through her boots as well. Without a word, he turned and scooped her up into his arms, ignoring her gasp of surprise. "I can walk," she protested. "Not without doing more damage to your feet," Isaac said. She weighed almost nothing to him, and he carried her as easily as he might carry a deer carcass. "Just tell me if I'm going in the right direction." Eleanor directed him through the woods, her arms wrapped around his neck for balance. Isaac tried not to think about how long it had been since he had been this close to another person, how strange and wonderful it felt to have someone depend on him again. During the war, he had been a sergeant, responsible for the lives of the men under his command. He had failed them in the end, watched them die in a muddy field in Virginia while he survived. And he had sworn never to be responsible for anyone again. Yet here he was, carrying this woman through the wilderness, and the weight of her in his arms felt right in a way he could not explain. They reached the Everett cabin just as the sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks. It was a rough structure, typical of mining families, with a single room and a stone chimney. A woman who could only be Eleanor's mother emerged as they approached, her face going pale at the sight of her bloody daughter in the arms of a mountain man. Eleanor, what happened? I got caught in thorns, Mama, Eleanor said quickly. This is Mr. Whitmore, Isaac supplied. Isaac Whitmore. I found her trapped and cut her free. Eleanor's mother, who introduced herself as Margaret Everett, ushered them inside while calling for her husband. Thomas Everett appeared from around the back of the cabin, dirt on his hands from whatever work he'd been doing. He was a thin man with kind eyes and the perpetually exhausted look of someone who had been broken by hard labor and disappointment. You saved my daughter, Thomas said, shaking Isaac's hand with surprising strength. We are in your debt, Mr. Whitmore. No debt, Isaac said uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same. But you were the one who was there, Margaret said. She was already heating water and gathering clean cloths. Please sit. Let me at least offer you supper. It is the least we can do. Isaac wanted to refuse, to return to his cabin and his solitary life. But something made him stay. Perhaps it was the way Eleanor looked at him with those green eyes, or the way the warm lamplight inside the cabin reminded him of the home he had once known, before the war destroyed everything. He sat at the rough-hewn table while Margaret cleaned Eleanor's wounds and Thomas peppered him with questions about the mountains and game and water sources. We have been here almost a year, Thomas said, and I still feel like I do not know these mountains at all. Every time I think I have found a good vein of gold, it peters out. And Margaret worries constantly about Eleanor wandering too far from the cabin. She was looking for blackberries, Isaac said, watching as Margaret carefully bandaged Eleanor's arms. The patch near that thorn tangle is rich with them. I make preserves, Margaret explained. We sell them in Eureka when we go down for supplies. It helps supplement what Thomas finds in his claim. An idea that had been forming in Isaac's mind all afternoon suddenly crystallized. What if the berries came to you instead? 3 sets of eyes turned to him. Isaac cleared his throat, unused to being the center of attention. I could clear that thorn patch and transplant berry bushes near your cabin. It would be safer for Eleanor, and you would have berries right outside your door. Could that even be done? Thomas asked doubtfully. Wild berries transplant well if you do it right, Isaac said. He had helped his mother with her garden back in Ohio before the war. The knowledge came back to him now, dusty with disuse, but still there. You dig up the roots and plant them in good soil with plenty of water. They would need to be tended, but they would produce. That would be a lot of work, Margaret said softly, looking at him with curiosity in her eyes. Why would you do that for us? Isaac's gaze drifted to Eleanor, who was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Because no one should have to suffer what she did today. Those thorns are vicious. Then we would be grateful, Thomas said, and you must let us repay you somehow. I do not need payment, Isaac said. But Margaret was already ladling stew into a bowl for him, and the smell of cooked meat and vegetables made his stomach clench with hunger. He ate alone most of the time, whatever game he could hunt, and the few vegetables that grew wild in the mountains. This home-cooked meal tasted like a forgotten dream. Over supper, Isaac learned more about the Everett family. They had come west from Missouri after the war, hoping to start fresh like so many others. Thomas had been a shopkeeper, but the store had failed, and they had sold everything to buy a wagon and join a train heading to California. Eleanor was their only child, 22 years old, and she had given up a teaching position to come west with her parents. I wanted adventure, Eleanor said with a rueful smile, gesturing at her bandaged arms. I suppose I found it today. Adventure and foolishness are often the same thing, Isaac said, but his tone was gentle. You have to respect these mountains. They are beautiful, but they are also deadly to those who are careless. Then perhaps you could teach me to be less careless, Eleanor said, meeting his eyes directly. If you are going to be clearing that thorn patch and planting berries, I should learn how to care for them properly. Isaac found himself agreeing before he had fully thought it through. He left the Everett cabin that night with a promise to return in 3 days with tools and a plan. And as he made his way back to his own small cabin deeper in the mountains, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. The next 3 days were busy. Isaac spent them preparing for the work ahead, sharpening his tools and thinking far too much about green eyes and copper hair. He told himself that he was simply being neighborly, helping people who needed help. He did not let himself examine too closely the fact that he felt more alive now than he had in 5 years. When he returned to the Everett cabin, he brought his best shovel and axe, along with leather gloves and a determination to do the job right. Eleanor was waiting for him, dressed in an old work dress with her bandaged arms covered by long sleeves. Her mother had clearly tried to make her stay inside, but Eleanor had a stubborn set to her jaw that Isaac was beginning to recognize. I am coming with you, she announced. They are going to be my berry bushes, so I should help plant them. You are injured, Isaac pointed out. The cuts are shallow. Mama cleaned them well. I will be careful. Isaac looked to Thomas and Margaret for support, but they both just shrugged. Our daughter has a mind of her own, Thomas said with evident pride. Always has. If she says she's helping, she's helping. So Isaac found himself hiking back to the thorn patch with Eleanor at his side. She kept up better than he expected, and she asked intelligent questions about the forest around them, about the different types of trees and plants they passed. He found himself talking more than he had in years, sharing knowledge he had accumulated during his time in the mountains. You really love it out here, Eleanor observed. I can hear it in your voice when you talk about the land. It is honest, Isaac said after a moment. The mountains do not lie. They do not ask you to be anything other than what you are. If you are strong and smart, you survive. If you are not, you do not. There is a simplicity to that which I find comforting. But do you not miss people? Conversation? Connection? Isaac was quiet for a long time. I did at first, but after a while the silence became its own kind of companion. I had seen enough of what people could do to each other during the war. The mountains seemed kinder by comparison. They reached the thorn patch, and Isaac set to work immediately. He used his axe to cut down the wild roses, chopping them off at ground level and then digging out the root systems. It was brutal work, and sweat soon soaked through his buckskin shirt despite the cool mountain air. Eleanor worked beside him, carefully gathering the cut canes and dragging them away from the work area, piling them where they could be burned later. Tell me about the war, Eleanor said, after they had worked in silence for over an hour. No. Why not? Because those are not stories for a lady's ears. Eleanor stopped dragging a thorny branch and turned to face him, hands on her hips. I am not some delicate flower who needs to be protected from reality, Mr. Whitmore. My father lost his store because he could not compete with the big suppliers after the war. We lost our home, our security, everything. We came west with barely anything, and I have worked every day since then to help my family survive. I can handle hearing about hard things. Isaac leaned on his axe, studying her. There was steel in this young woman, strength hidden beneath the pretty surface. I was a sergeant, he said finally. I led men into battle, good men, brave men, and I watched them die because I made a wrong decision. I ordered them to hold a position that could not be held, and they followed my orders because that is what soldiers do. Every single one of them died. I was the only survivor. That was not your fault, Eleanor said softly. How do you know? You were not there. Because you are here, doing this. Eleanor gestured at the half-cleared thorn patch. You saw me trapped and in pain, and you stopped everything to help me. You are spending days of your time to make sure I will be safe, picking berries in the future. That is not the action of a man who makes careless decisions that get people killed. Isaac turned back to his work, swinging the axe with perhaps more force than necessary. He did not trust himself to speak. No one had ever said anything like that to him before, had ever suggested that maybe he was not the monster he believed himself to be. They worked until the sun was low in the sky, and Isaac had cleared about half of the thorn patch. The blackberry bushes beyond were even more abundant than he had initially thought, their canes heavy with ripe berries. He showed Eleanor how to identify the healthiest plants, the ones with the deepest root systems that would transplant best. We will come back tomorrow and start moving them, Isaac said. We need to dig them up carefully. Keep as much of the root ball intact as possible. Then we will plant them near your cabin where they will get morning sun, but be shaded in the afternoon. They will need regular water, especially for the first few months. You have done this before, Eleanor observed. My mother had a garden. Before the war, I helped her with it every spring. Isaac's voice went distant. She grew the most beautiful roses, not wild ones like these, but cultivated varieties she had brought with her when she married my father. She loved those roses more than almost anything. What happened to her? Fever took her while I was away fighting. My father followed 6 months later. Some said it was grief that killed him. Isaac picked up his tools. I should have been there. But you were serving your country, Eleanor said. You were doing your duty. Duty? Isaac tasted the word like it was bitter. I used to believe in duty, in honor, in all those fine words they used to convince young men to march off to war. Now I just believe in survival. Eleanor touched his arm, her bandaged fingers light against his buckskin sleeve. I think you believe in more than that, Isaac Whitmore. Otherwise you would not be here right now. The use of his first name sent a strange warmth through his chest. He looked down at her, at the way the fading sunlight caught in her copper hair, and felt something shift inside him, some long-frozen part of his heart beginning to thaw. We should get you home, he said roughly. Your parents will worry. They walked back to the Everett cabin in a comfortable silence, and when they arrived, Margaret insisted that Isaac stay for supper again. This time he agreed more readily, and he found himself drawn into the warm domesticity of the family's evening routine. Thomas told stories about the mine, about the small amounts of gold he found, and the larger amounts he hoped to find. Margaret shared news from Eureka, gleaned from their last supply trip. And Eleanor sat beside Isaac at the table, so close their elbows occasionally brushed, and he found he did not mind at all. Over the next 2 weeks, Isaac spent more time with the Everett family than he had spent with any other people in 5 years. He and Eleanor worked together daily, clearing the rest of the thorn patch and carefully transplanting berry bushes to a spot Isaac had prepared near the cabin. He dug each hole himself, making sure they were deep enough and filled with good soil. He showed Eleanor how to water them properly, how to recognize signs of stress in the plants, how to prune them to encourage growth. But more than that, he found himself talking to her. Really talking in a way he had not talked to anyone since before the war. She asked him questions, and instead of giving curt answers, he found himself opening up. He told her about his childhood in Ohio, about learning to hunt with his father, about the books his mother had read to him. He told her about the men he had served with, not about how they died, but about who they had been when they were alive, what they had dreamed about, what they had hoped to do after the war ended. And Eleanor told him about her life too, about teaching in a small schoolhouse in Missouri, about the children she had loved and had to leave behind, about her dreams of seeing the West, of experiencing something beyond the small town where she had grown up, about the fear and excitement of leaving everything familiar behind to start over in a new place. "Sometimes I wonder if we made a mistake," she admitted one afternoon as they tamped soil around the roots of a newly planted berry bush. "My father works so hard, and we have so little to show for it. The gold is running out in these mountains. Everyone knows it. In a few years, there will be nothing left to find." "What will you do then?" Isaac asked. "I do not know. My father talks about trying farming, but the growing season is so short up here. Maybe we will have to move on again, find someplace else to try to build a life." She looked up at him, and there was something vulnerable in her expression. "I am tired of moving, Isaac. I want to put down roots like these berry bushes. I want to have a place that is mine, where I can stay." Isaac felt his chest tighten. He wanted to tell her that she could stay here, that he would help her family make it work. But what could he offer? He was just a man living alone in the mountains, running from his past. He had nothing to give anyone. But as the berry bushes took root and began to flourish under Eleanor's careful tending, Isaac found that the walls he had built around his heart were crumbling too. He started visiting the Everett cabin, even when there was no work to be done on the berry bushes. He brought game he had hunted, venison and rabbit and wild turkey. He helped Thomas with repairs to the cabin, using his strength to do in hours what would have taken the older man days. He taught Eleanor to identify edible plants in the forest, safe paths through the mountains, how to read the weather in the clouds. And slowly, without meaning to, he fell in love. It was Margaret who noticed first. One evening after supper, when Isaac was preparing to return to his own cabin, she walked him outside and spoke quietly so the others would not hear. "You care for my daughter," she said. It was not a question. Isaac felt heat rise to his face. "I have enjoyed getting to know your family." "That is not what I said." Margaret looked at him with a mother's knowing eyes. "Eleanor cares for you too. I see the way she looks at you when you're not watching. I see how happy she is when you come to visit. She deserves better than a man like me," Isaac said. "I have nothing to offer her. I live alone in a cabin in the woods. I have no money, no prospects, nothing." "You have yourself," Margaret said. "And from what I have seen, that is more than most men can offer. You are kind and strong and patient. You have taught my daughter more in these few weeks than she learned in months on her own. You make her laugh. You make her feel safe. Those things matter more than gold." "I am 10 years older than her," Isaac protested. "I have seen and done terrible things. The war changed me in ways I cannot undo." "The war changed everyone," Margaret said gently. "My husband came back different too. But different is not the same as broken." "You are not broken, Isaac. You are just a man who has been hurt and who needs time to heal. Eleanor could be part of that healing if you let her." Isaac rode back to his cabin that night with his mind in turmoil. He had not allowed himself to even think about a future with Eleanor, had not dared to hope that someone like her could want someone like him. But Margaret's words had planted a seed, and now he could not stop thinking about what it might be like to have Eleanor in his life permanently, to build something together in these mountains. The next morning, He woke to the sound of rain drumming on his roof. It was a hard rain, the kind that could turn creeks into raging torrents and wash out trails. Isaac's first thought was of Eleanor and her parents, stuck in their small cabin with a leaking roof that Thomas had been meaning to fix, but had not yet gotten around to. He gathered his tools and rode through the storm to the Everett place, arriving soaked to the skin to find Thomas up on the roof in the pouring rain, trying desperately to nail down shingles while water poured into the cabin below. Isaac did not wait to be asked. He climbed up beside Thomas, and together they worked to patch the worst of the leaks, their hands numb from cold and their clothes plastered to their bodies. When the work was done and they climbed down, Eleanor met them with blankets and hot coffee. Her eyes were wide with worry, and she fussed over Isaac in a way that made his heart ache. "You are frozen through," she scolded. "You should not have come out in this weather." "Your roof needed fixing," Isaac said simply. "We would have managed. But you do not have to manage alone anymore." The words came out before Isaac had fully thought them through, but once they were said, he realized they were true. "You have me now, if you want me." Eleanor stared at him, coffee cup forgotten in her hands. "What are you saying, Isaac?" He looked at Thomas and Margaret, who were watching with barely concealed hope in their eyes, and then back at Eleanor. He was terrified. More terrified than he had been facing enemy soldiers. But he forced himself to speak. "I am saying that these past weeks with you and your family have been the happiest I have had in years. I am saying that I look forward to seeing you every day. That I think about you when I am alone in my cabin at night. That the sound of your voice makes everything seem brighter. I am saying that I care for you, Eleanor Everett. And if you would allow it, I would like to court you properly." Eleanor set down the coffee cup very carefully, and then she crossed the room and took both of Isaac's hands in hers. "I have been waiting for you to say something like that for days now," she said, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "Yes, Isaac, I would like that very much." Thomas cleared his throat loudly. "Well then, I suppose we should discuss your intentions toward my daughter, Mr. Whitmore." Over the next hour, while the rain continued to pour outside, Isaac laid out everything honestly. He told Thomas and Margaret about his cabin, about the land he had claimed, about his plans to build a larger home when he had time and resources. He explained that he made his living through hunting and trapping, selling furs in Eureka 3 or 4 times a year. It was not a fortune, but it was a steady income, and he had saved most of what he earned since he had few expenses living alone in the mountains. "I know it is not much," Isaac said, "but I would work hard to provide for Eleanor. I would build her a proper home, and I would keep her safe. That I can promise you." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "I believe you, son. You have already proven yourself to be a man of your word. If Eleanor wants this, then you have my blessing." The courtship that followed was unlike anything Isaac had experienced in his youth. Back in Ohio before the war, courtship had meant supervised visits and formal dances and carefully worded letters. Here in the mountains, it meant long walks through the forest with Eleanor at his side, teaching her to track deer and identify bird song. It meant working together on projects, their hands sometimes touching as they passed tools or adjusted a fence post. It meant quiet evenings at the Everett cabin, talking by lamplight while her parents discreetly busied themselves with other tasks. Isaac found that he was good at courtship, at least this informal version of it. He brought Eleanor gifts from the forest, interesting rocks and bird feathers, and once a small carved box he had made from cedar wood. She treasured each gift, and she gave him things in return. A pair of warm socks she had knitted, a shirt she had mended when she noticed it was torn, a drawing she had made of the mountain peaks visible from her cabin. "You are an artist," Isaac said, studying the drawing with amazement. The lines were confident and sure, capturing not just the shapes of the mountains, but somehow their essence, their majesty. "I used to draw all the time," Eleanor said, "but I fell out of practice after we moved west. There was always so much work to do, and it seemed frivolous to spend time on art." "It is not frivolous," Isaac said firmly. "Beauty matters. Creating things matters. You should draw more." After that, Eleanor began carrying a small sketchbook with her on their walks, and Isaac would watch as she quickly captured scenes that caught her eye. A deer drinking from a stream, an old pine tree twisted by wind, his own profile as he stood looking out over a valley. He had never been the subject of art before, and it made him feel seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and wonderful. As summer faded into autumn, the berry bushes Isaac had planted flourished beyond anyone's expectations. They produced an abundant harvest, more than enough for Margaret to make preserves for sale in Eureka. When Thomas took the first batch to town, he returned with more money than the entire family had seen in months, and news that several store owners wanted to place regular orders. "They say Margaret's preserves are the best they have tasted," Thomas reported, beaming. "We could make a real business of this if we could produce enough quantity." "We will need more bushes then," Isaac said. Over the next weeks, he transplanted even more berry bushes, creating a large patch beside the Everett cabin. He built protective fencing around them to keep out deer and rabbits, and he showed Eleanor and Margaret how to properly prune and fertilize the plants to maximize production. But as autumn deepened and the first snows began to fall in the high peaks, Isaac knew he needed to make a decision. Winter in the mountains was harsh, and it would not be safe for him to travel regularly between his cabin and the Everett place once the heavy snows came. He could wait until spring to move his relationship with Eleanor forward. But the thought of spending months away from her felt unbearable. One evening in late October, when the aspens were turning gold and the air had a sharp bite to it, Isaac asked Thomas if he could speak with him privately. They walked out to the berry patch, now bare of fruit but healthy and strong, ready to go dormant for winter. "I want to marry your daughter," Isaac said without preamble. "I know we have not been courting long, but I am certain of my feelings. I love Eleanor, and I believe she loves me. I want to make her my wife, if you will allow it, and if she will have me." Thomas smiled, and Isaac realized the older man had been expecting this. "You have my blessing, son. You have had it since the day you carried my bloody daughter out of those thorns. But Eleanor is her own woman. You will need to ask her yourself." Isaac had been planning to wait for the perfect moment, perhaps to propose during one of their walks with some romantic view as a backdrop. But when he returned to the cabin and saw Eleanor there, helping her mother prepare supper with flour on her cheek and her copper hair escaping its pins, he could not wait another moment. "Eleanor," he said, and something in his tone made her turn and look at him fully. "Could you walk with me for a moment?" She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him outside. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Isaac led her to the berry patch, to the place where weeks ago they had planted the first bushes together. "Do you remember the day I found you in the thorns?" Isaac asked. "I am not likely to forget it," Eleanor said with a small laugh. "I still have faint scars on my arms. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen," Isaac continued. "Even bloody and trapped and frightened, there was something about you that reached inside me and woke up parts of myself I thought had died in the war. And then, as I got to know you, as I spent time with you and your family, I realized that I did not have to live alone in the mountains forever. I realized that maybe I could have a life again, a real life, with someone to share it with. Eleanor's eyes had gone very wide, and she pressed one hand to her chest. Isaac, I love you, Eleanor Everett, Isaac said. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you laugh at my terrible jokes. I love how you are not afraid of hard work and how you see beauty everywhere you look. I love that you believed I was good when I could not believe it myself. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build a home with you and fill it with love and laughter. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. Will you marry me? Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face, but she was smiling so brightly that Isaac felt his heart might burst. Yes, she said. Yes, of course I will marry you, Isaac Whitmore. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time. Her lips were soft and she tasted like the cinnamon cookies her mother had been baking. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor laughed and wiped at her eyes. I have been hoping you would ask, she admitted. I have been in love with you since the day you carried me home. You were so gentle with me, even though you looked so fierce. I knew then that beneath all that muscle and beard was a good heart. They told her parents that night, and Margaret cried happy tears while Thomas broke out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. They toasted to the future, to love, to new beginnings in the wild mountains of Colorado. When will you marry? Margaret asked. As soon as possible, Isaac said, looking at Eleanor. Before the heavy snows come, if we can arrange it. There is a circuit preacher who comes through Eureka. If we can catch him before he moves on for the winter, we could be married within a few weeks. It was decided that Thomas would ride to Eureka the next morning to see if he could locate the preacher and arrange for a wedding. In the meantime, Isaac and Eleanor began making plans for their future. Isaac's cabin was too small for a married couple, so he would need to build an addition or perhaps an entirely new home. They discussed locations, settling on a spot about halfway between Isaac's current cabin and the Everett place, near a good water source with views of the valley below. I will start clearing the land as soon as we are married, Isaac promised. We can stay in my cabin for the winter, and I will build us a proper home in the spring. I do not need a fancy home, Eleanor said. I just need you. Thomas returned from Eureka 3 days later with good news. The circuit preacher, Reverend Samuel Morrison, was still in town and had agreed to perform the wedding ceremony the following Saturday. It gave them less than a week to prepare, but no one seemed to mind the rush. Margaret went into a frenzy of activity, sewing Eleanor a proper wedding dress from fabric she had been saving. Isaac rode to his cabin and spent 2 days chopping wood to ensure that Thomas and Margaret would have enough fuel to last through the winter. He also bathed and trimmed his beard and cut his hair, wanting to look his best for Eleanor on their wedding day. When Saturday arrived, the small group made the journey to Eureka together. The town was bustling with miners and traders preparing for winter, but they found Reverend Morrison at the small church on the edge of town. He was an elderly man with kind eyes who seemed pleased to be performing a wedding rather than a funeral, which he said was his usual business in mining country. Eleanor looked beautiful in her new dress, her copper hair arranged in an elegant style by her mother. Isaac wore his best buckskin shirt and a new pair of pants he had purchased in town that morning. He felt awkward and uncomfortable in the unfamiliar clothes, but the look in Eleanor's eyes when she saw him made it worthwhile. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Isaac spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, promising to love and cherish Eleanor for the rest of his life, to provide for her and protect her, to be faithful to her in all things. Eleanor's voice shook with emotion as she made her own promises, but her eyes never left his face. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed Eleanor with joy so intense it felt like pain. This beautiful, brave woman was his now, and he was hers, and they would face whatever the future held together. They spent their wedding night in a small hotel in Eureka, a luxury that Isaac paid for gladly. It was the first time they had been truly alone together, and he was nervous in a way he had not been nervous since before the war. But Eleanor took his hands and smiled at him, and all the nervousness faded away. "I love you," she whispered. "I am so happy I got caught in those thorns." Isaac laughed and pulled her close. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." They returned to the mountains the next day, stopping first at the Everett cabin so Eleanor could gather her belongings. Margaret cried as she hugged her daughter goodbye, but they were happy tears. "You are not going far," Thomas reminded her. "We will see them all the time." "I know," Margaret said, "but she is married now. My little girl is all grown up." Isaac's cabin was indeed small, barely large enough for one person, let alone two. But Eleanor pronounced it cozy and immediately set about making it feel like home. She hung curtains she had sewn, arranged their few possessions neatly, and cooked their first meal together as husband and wife on the small iron stove. That night, lying in Isaac's narrow bed with Eleanor warm in his arms, Isaac felt something he had not felt in almost a decade. Peace. The ghosts of the war still haunted him, the memories of the men he had failed. But they seemed more distant now. Eleanor's presence had brought light into the darkness that had surrounded him for so long. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked sleepily. "That I am the luckiest man alive," Isaac said honestly, "and that I cannot believe you are really mine." "I am really yours," Eleanor confirmed. "Forever." Winter came early that year, with heavy snows that isolated them in the cabin for days at a time. But Isaac did not mind. He and Eleanor spent those long winter days and nights learning each other, talking and laughing and making love by the fire. He taught her to cook venison in a dozen different ways, and she taught him songs from her childhood. They read together from the few books they had, Isaac's deep voice and Eleanor's lighter one taking turns with the words. When the weather allowed, they made the trek to visit Thomas and Margaret, and they were always warmly welcomed. The berry bushes had gone dormant for winter, but they looked healthy, their bare canes promising abundant growth in spring. Thomas reported that orders for Margaret's preserves were already coming in for next year, enough that they would need to significantly expand production. "This could really work," Thomas said with more hope in his voice than Isaac had ever heard. "We could make a real living from this, not just scraping by. And it is all thanks to you, Isaac." "It is thanks to all of us," Isaac said. "You and Margaret doing the preserves, Eleanor tending the bushes, me just doing the heavy work." "Do not sell yourself short," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. "None of this would exist if you had not helped me that day." As winter slowly gave way to spring, Isaac began work on their new home. He had chosen a beautiful spot with views of the valley and mountains beyond, and he worked tirelessly to clear the land and lay the foundation. Thomas helped when he could spare time from his mine, and even Eleanor pitched in, moving smaller stones and helping to mix mortar. The house took shape slowly but surely. Isaac built it with care, making sure every log was straight, every joint tight. He included large windows so Eleanor would have good light for her drawing, and a spacious kitchen where she could cook and preserve berries alongside her mother. He built a loft bedroom with views of the stars, and a covered porch where they could sit on summer evenings. By the time the berry bushes burst into bloom in late spring, filling the air with their sweet fragrance, the house was nearly complete. Eleanor stood in the middle of the main room, turning in a slow circle with tears in her eyes. "It is perfect," she said. "Isaac, you built me a perfect home." "I built us a perfect home," Isaac corrected. "This is ours, Eleanor, yours and mine together." They moved into the new house in early June, and Eleanor immediately set about making it truly theirs. She hung her drawings on the walls, arranged wildflowers in jars on the table, and filled the shelves with books and small treasures they had collected. Isaac built furniture, a proper bed and chairs, and a large table where they could eat and work. The berry bushes produced magnificently that summer. The ones Isaac had planted for the Everetts yielded basket after basket of plump, sweet fruit, and Margaret's preserves sold out as fast as she could make them. With the profits, Thomas was able to hire help for his mine, and for the first time since coming west, the family was not just surviving, but thriving. Isaac and Eleanor fell into a comfortable rhythm. He hunted and trapped, bringing in steady income from furs and meat. She helped her mother with the preserves and tended a garden near their home, growing vegetables and herbs. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains, talking about their day or simply enjoying each other's presence. One evening in late summer, as they sat watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, Eleanor took Isaac's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I am with child," she said softly. "We are going to have a baby." Isaac stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. A baby. His baby. Their baby. "Are you certain?" "Quite certain. I saw the doctor in Eureka last week when we went for supplies. He says I'm about 3 months along. The baby should come in late winter or early spring." Isaac pulled her into his arms, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "A baby," he whispered. "Eleanor, we are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though she was smiling because she clearly already knew the answer. "I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and amazed all at once." Isaac kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You have given me so much already, and now you are giving me this. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that I found you in those thorns." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the autumn months. Eleanor bloomed with health, her cheeks rosy and her copper hair shinier than ever. Isaac became even more protective than usual, insisting that she rest frequently and refusing to let her do any heavy work. Margaret came to visit often, bringing advice and baby clothes she was sewing, excited at the prospect of becoming a grandmother. "Do you hope for a boy or a girl?" Margaret asked one afternoon as she and Eleanor sat sewing tiny garments. "I just hope for healthy," Eleanor said. "But Isaac keeps talking about teaching a son to hunt and track. I think he wants a boy." That night, Eleanor asked Isaac directly, "Do you want a son?" Isaac considered the question carefully. "I want a healthy baby and a healthy wife," he said. "Boy or girl, I will love our child. But I will admit that the thought of having a son does appeal to me. Someone to teach everything I know, to pass on my skills and knowledge. And if we have a daughter, then I will teach her everything too," Isaac said firmly. "A girl in these mountains needs to know how to survive just as much as a boy does, and I will love her just as fiercely." Winter came again, and this time Isaac was prepared. He had stockpiled firewood, preserved meat, and stored vegetables. Their home was tight and warm, and Eleanor stayed comfortable even when the snow piled high outside. As her time grew closer, Isaac became increasingly anxious, worried about all the things that could go wrong. Margaret tried to reassure him, but he had heard too many stories of women dying in childbirth, of babies that did not survive. "I cannot lose you," he told Eleanor one night when she found him unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling. "If something happened to you, I would not survive it." "Nothing is going to happen to me," Eleanor said, though Isaac knew she could not promise that. "I am strong, and my mother will be here to help, and we have done everything right. You have to have faith, Isaac." When Eleanor's labor began on a cold February morning, Isaac rode through snow to fetch Margaret and then tried to stay out of the way as the two women took over his home. He paced on the porch despite the freezing temperature, praying to a God he had largely ignored since the war, making bargains and promises if only Eleanor and the baby would be safe. The labor lasted all day and into the night. Isaac heard Eleanor cry out in pain, and it took all his willpower not to burst into the bedroom. Thomas arrived in the afternoon and sat with Isaac, offering quiet companionship and occasional swigs from a flask of whiskey. "This is the hardest part of being a man," Thomas said. "We can hunt and fight and build, but when it comes to this, we are helpless. All we can do is wait and hope and pray." Just after midnight, Isaac heard a new sound, the sharp, angry cry of a newborn baby. He was on his feet immediately, and moments later Margaret emerged from the bedroom, her face exhausted but smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A big, healthy, beautiful boy. And Eleanor is tired, but fine." Isaac nearly collapsed with relief. "Can I see them?" "Of course. They are waiting for you." He entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Eleanor was propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket that Margaret had made. Isaac approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around with unfocused dark eyes. He had wispy dark hair and Isaac's strong bone structure already visible in his small face. He was perfect. "Do you want to hold him?" Eleanor asked. Isaac had held many things in his large hands, axes and rifles, reins and ropes, even Eleanor herself. But nothing had ever felt as precious or as fragile as his son when Eleanor placed him in his arms. The baby weighed almost nothing, and Isaac was terrified he would somehow hurt him. But the infant seemed content, making small snuffling sounds as he settled against his father's chest. "He is perfect," Isaac whispered. "Eleanor, he is absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had not settled on anything definite. Isaac looked down at his son, at this tiny person who represented a future he had never dared to dream of. And suddenly he knew. "Henry," he said, "after my father. Henry Thomas Whitmore, if that sits well with you. Thomas for your father." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "It sits very well with me. Hello, Henry. Welcome to the world, little one." Over the next weeks, Isaac learned what it meant to be a father. He learned how to hold Henry properly, how to change him and swaddle him. He learned to function on very little sleep, waking multiple times each night when Henry cried. He learned that his huge hands, so good at chopping wood and skinning animals, could also be incredibly gentle when cradling his son's small head. He also learned a depth of love he had not known existed. When Henry looked at him with those dark eyes, when the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around Isaac's large one, when he fell asleep on Isaac's chest with complete trust, Isaac felt his heart expand in ways he had not thought possible. "You are a natural father," Eleanor told him one evening watching as he walked around the room with Henry, bouncing him gently and humming a song his own mother had once sung. "I just do not want to fail him the way I failed those men in the war," Isaac admitted. "You did not fail those men, and you will not fail our son," Eleanor said firmly. "You are a good man, Isaac Whitmore. When will you finally believe that?" As spring arrived and the snow melted, revealing the green shoots of new growth, the berry bushes burst back to life with even more vigor than the previous year. The business of preserves had become so successful that Thomas had given up his mine entirely to focus on expanding the berry operation. He and Isaac worked together to plant even more bushes, creating a large commercial operation that employed several people from Eureka to help with harvesting and processing. "We should think of a name for the business," Thomas said one day as they worked. "Something that will help people remember where these fine preserves come from." "Thorn Creek Preserves," Isaac suggested, after the place where it all started. Thomas laughed. "I like it. And it is appropriate, given that Eleanor getting caught in those thorns is what brought you into our lives." The years that followed were the happiest of Isaac's life. He watched Henry grow from an infant into a toddler, taking his first steps and saying his first words. He and Eleanor had 2 more children, a daughter they named Clara Rose and another son they called Michael. Their home was filled with laughter and noise and love. Thorn Creek Preserves became known throughout Colorado and beyond, with Margaret's recipes winning awards at state fairs. The business provided a comfortable living for both families, and Thomas and Margaret were able to build a new, larger house near the berry fields. Isaac continued to hunt and trap, but he also helped manage the business, using his strength for the heavy work and his wilderness knowledge to protect the berry bushes from animals and harsh weather. He never forgot his past, the war and the men who had died. But with Eleanor's help, he learned to make peace with those memories. She encouraged him to talk about his experiences, to honor the men he had served with by remembering them not as failures, but as heroes who had given everything for what they believed in. "You survived for a reason," Eleanor told him. "You survived so you could be here with me and our children. You survived so you could build this life and help my family and create something beautiful out of all that pain. That is not failure, Isaac. That is triumph." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Isaac took Eleanor back to the place where he had first found her, trapped in the thorns. The wild rose bushes were still there, though Isaac had cleared paths around them so no one else would suffer Eleanor's fate. The blackberry bushes grew wild and abundant, untouched now that the cultivated bushes provided more than enough fruit. "Do you remember how frightened I was?" Eleanor asked, looking at the thorn patch. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met," Isaac said. "You were bleeding and trapped, and you still had the courage to trust a complete stranger who looked more beast than man. I knew you were good the moment I saw you," Eleanor said. "Something in your eyes, behind all that wild hair and beard. I saw kindness there and strength and a sadness that made me want to help you." "You did help me," Isaac said. "You saved me, Eleanor. I was lost in these mountains, lost in my own guilt and grief. You brought me back to life." They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, looking at the place where their story had begun. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of their children playing, Henry's deep voice calling to his younger siblings. They were building a fort, Isaac knew, using branches and his old trapping skills that he had taught them. "We should head back," Eleanor said eventually. "Henry promised to catch fish for supper, and I want to make sure he does not let Clara do all the work again." "Clara is better at fishing than he is?" Isaac said with a laugh. "She has more patience." They walked back to their home together, through the forest that Isaac knew like the back of his hand. The mountains rose around them, magnificent and eternal, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold. Smoke rose from the chimney of their home, and Isaac could see Margaret and Thomas's house in the distance, a second column of smoke showing they were preparing their own evening meal. This was his life now, not running from the past, but building toward the future. Not alone in the wilderness, but surrounded by family and love. Not haunted by failure, but embracing success and joy. All because one day he had heard a scream in the forest and had gone to investigate. All because he had found a woman trapped in thorns and had chosen to help her. That single moment of compassion had changed everything, had given him back his life and his hope. That night, after the children were asleep and he and Eleanor were lying in their bed, looking out at the stars through the loft window, Isaac pulled his wife close and kissed her softly. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" Eleanor asked. "For getting caught in those thorns. For trusting me to free you. For seeing something worth loving in a broken mountain man. For giving me a family and a purpose and a reason to believe that good things can happen even after terrible ones. For everything." Eleanor smiled and touched his bearded cheek. "You do not need to thank me for any of that. Loving you has been the greatest joy of my life, Isaac Whitmore. Every single day, I am grateful that I wandered too deep into those woods and found you. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it," Isaac promised, just as he had on their wedding night 10 years ago. "I know you will," Eleanor said. "You already have." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, safe and warm and loved. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pine trees, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out to its mate. The berry bushes that Isaac had planted with such care grew strong and healthy, their roots deep in the mountain soil, just like the family he and Eleanor had created together. The thorns that had once trapped her had become the foundation of their happiness, the catalyst for a love story that would last the rest of their lives. And every time Isaac looked at the berry bushes heavy with fruit, every time he tasted one of Margaret's preserves, every time he held Eleanor close, he remembered that day in the forest and gave thanks. He had cleared the thorns and planted her berry bushes safe. But in doing so, he had planted something else as well. Hope, love, and a future brighter than any he had dared to imagine. The wild mountains of Colorado had witnessed his pain and his healing, his loneliness and his joy. They had brought him Eleanor, and Eleanor had brought him home. Years continued to pass in their mountain paradise, each season bringing its own rhythms and rewards. Henry grew into a strong young man, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, with his mother's quick intelligence and artistic eye. He took to the wilderness naturally, learning everything Isaac could teach him about tracking and hunting and surviving in the mountains. But he also had Eleanor's gentle soul, and he often spent his free time sketching the animals he tracked rather than killing them unnecessarily. Clara Rose became the image of her mother, with copper hair and green eyes and a determination that sometimes left Isaac shaking his head in wonder. She insisted on learning everything her brother learned, refusing to be left behind because she was a girl. Isaac taught her to shoot and track and ride, and she proved herself as capable as any boy. She also inherited her mother's talent for art and her grandmother's gift for cooking. And by the time she was 15, she was creating her own preserve recipes that sold as well as Margaret's. Michael, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family. He loved books and learning, and he would listen for hours as Isaac told stories of his childhood in Ohio or the history of the mountains. He was less interested in hunting and more fascinated by the plants and herbs that grew wild, learning their uses for medicine and cooking. Eleanor encouraged his studies, and they often worked together in the garden, experimenting with new crops and varieties. When Henry turned 19, he announced that he wanted to start his own business, guiding wealthy Eastern tourists through the mountains. The tourism trade was growing in Colorado, and Henry believed there was money to be made, showing city folk the wilderness while keeping them safe. It would be good for the family business, too, Henry argued over supper one evening. I could take clients past the berry fields, tell them the story of how you and Mother met. People love a good romance, and it might drive sales. Isaac was hesitant at first, worried about the dangers of taking inexperienced people into the mountains. But Eleanor encouraged him to let Henry try, reminding him that their son needed to make his own way in the world. You were younger than he is when you went off to war, she pointed out. And this is much safer than that. So Isaac gave his blessing, and Henry started his guide business with enthusiasm and natural talent. He had inherited his father's strength and wilderness skills along with his mother's charm and ability to tell a story. Within 2 years, his business was thriving, and he was hiring other young men from Eureka to help with the growing demand. Clara decided she wanted to expand the preserve business into other products, creating jams and syrups and dried fruits. She had a head for numbers that surprised everyone, and she began managing the financial side of Thorn Creek Preserves, finding new markets and negotiating better prices. Under her management, the business grew from a local operation to one that shipped products across the Western Territories. Michael eventually left for Denver to study medicine, with plans to return to the mountains and serve the scattered communities that had little access to doctors. Isaac was proud of all his children, amazed that he and Eleanor had raised such capable, good-hearted people. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep when he was 73, surrounded by family. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the berry fields he had helped create, and Margaret insisted that it was exactly what he would have wanted. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see 2 of her grandchildren married and to hold her first great-grandchild. When she died, she was laid to rest beside Thomas, and Eleanor planted wild roses around both graves. Isaac felt the loss of his in-laws deeply. They had welcomed him into their family when he had nothing, had trusted him with their daughter, had become the parents he had lost so many years before. But he also felt grateful for the years they had shared, for the love and acceptance they had given him. They made me believe I deserved happiness, Isaac told Eleanor after Margaret's funeral. When I thought I was beyond redemption, they saw something worth saving. Because there was something worth saving, Eleanor said firmly. She was in her 40s now, her copper hair threaded with silver. But to Isaac, she was as beautiful as the day he had pulled her from the Thorns. You were always a good man, Isaac. You just needed to remember how to see it. As the years advanced, Isaac found himself slowing down. His body, which had been so strong for so long, began to show the wear of a hard life. Old injuries from the war ached in cold weather, and he could not work from dawn to dusk the way he once had. But he did not mind. He had earned his rest, and there was pleasure in sitting on the porch with Eleanor, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played. Henry married a girl from Eureka, a smart and pretty young woman named Sarah, who took to mountain life with enthusiasm. They gave Isaac and Eleanor their first grandchildren, twin boys who were as wild and energetic as their father had been. Clara eventually married one of Henry's guide partners, a steady young man who adored her and supported her business ambitions. They had 3 daughters who inherited Clara's copper hair and business sense. Michael returned from Denver as promised, bringing with him a wife who was also a doctor. Together, they established a medical practice that served the mountain communities, and they built a house near Isaac and Eleanor so their children could grow up knowing their grandparents. Isaac lived to see all his grandchildren grow to adulthood, to attend their weddings and meet their children. He lived to see Thorn Creek Preserves become one of the most successful businesses in Colorado, with products sold across the country. He lived to see Henry's guide business expand to include lodges and outfitting services. He lived to see Michael save countless lives with his medical skills. But most importantly, he lived every single day with Eleanor at his side, his best friend and true love, the woman who had saved him in ways that went far beyond that first meeting in the Thorns. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a celebration that brought people from all over Colorado. The party was held at the original berry fields, now vast and productive under Clara's management. There were speeches and toasts, stories and laughter, and a cake that stood 4 layers tall. Isaac stood before the gathered crowd, Eleanor's hand in his, and looked at the faces surrounding them, his children and their spouses, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, friends and business partners, and people whose lives had been touched in some way by the family he and Eleanor had built together 50 years ago. Isaac began, his voice still strong despite his age. I was a man living alone in these mountains, convinced that I did not deserve happiness or love or any kind of meaningful life. I had survived a war that killed so many of my friends, and I carried that guilt with me every day. I thought the best I could do was stay away from people so I would not fail anyone else. He squeezed Eleanor's hand, and she smiled up at him with tears in her eyes. And then, one day I heard a scream. A young woman had gotten herself tangled in the worst patch of thorns I had ever seen, and something made me help her. I could have walked away. Part of me wanted to, but I did not, and that decision changed my entire life. Eleanor saw something in me that I could not see in myself. She saw past the wild beard and the rough clothes and the walls I had built around my heart. She saw a man worth loving, and she loved me anyway. She gave me a family and a purpose, and 50 years of joy that I never thought I would have. So on this, our 50th anniversary, I want to say thank you. Thank you to Eleanor for getting caught in those thorns, for trusting me, for loving me. Thank you to Thomas and Margaret for accepting me into your family. Thank you to my children for making me proud every single day. Thank you to my grandchildren for filling my old age with laughter and love. And thank you to all of you for being part of this incredible life that started with one moment of compassion in the wilderness. Isaac raised his glass, his arm around Eleanor's waist. To love that grows from the thorns, to berry bushes planted safe, to family and faith and 50 years of happiness. May we all be so blessed. The crowd cheered and drank, and then the music started and people began to dance. Isaac took Eleanor in his arms and led her in a slow waltz, aware of every eye on them, but caring only about the woman in his embrace. Have I told you today that I love you? He whispered in her ear. Only 3 or 4 times, Eleanor replied with a laugh. But I never tire of hearing it. I love you, Eleanor Whitmore. More today than yesterday, and I will love you even more tomorrow. And I love you, Isaac, my mountain man, my hero, my heart. They danced until the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that had witnessed 50 years of their love story. Around them, their family laughed and celebrated, and the berry bushes Isaac had planted so long ago swayed gently in the evening breeze, heavy with fruit, their roots deep and strong in the mountain soil. Isaac had cleared the thorns and planted her berry bushes safe. But in doing so, he had cultivated something far more valuable than any crop. He had grown a family, a legacy, and a love that would endure long after he was gone. The thorns that had once caused pain had become the source of prosperity and joy. The woman he had rescued him in return. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Isaac looked up at them and thought of the men he had lost in the war, the friends and comrades who would never have the chance to grow old, to marry, to have children and grandchildren. He thought of them often still, but the guilt that had once consumed him had transformed into gratitude. He had survived so he could live this life, love this woman, build this family. His survival had not been meaningless after all. It had been purposeful, necessary, a gift he had finally learned to accept. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked, following his gaze to the stars. "That I am grateful," Isaac said simply. "For everything. For you most of all." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching their family celebrate around them. This was peace. This was joy. This was home. The mountain man who had once lived alone in the wilderness, haunted by his past and convinced of his own unworthiness, had found redemption in the most unexpected way. All because he had chosen kindness over indifference, compassion over isolation, love over fear. All because he had stopped when he heard a woman scream and had freed her from the thorns that trapped her. And in freeing her, he had freed himself. The story that had begun with blood and thorns had blossomed into something beautiful, something lasting, something true. The berry bushes Isaac had planted would continue to produce fruit long after he was gone, tended by his children and grandchildren and their children after them. The business would endure. The family would grow. And the love story of Isaac and Eleanor would be told and retold, passed down through generations as an example of how one moment of courage and compassion can change everything. As the celebration continued into the night, Isaac and Eleanor slipped away from the crowd, walking hand in hand to the place where it had all begun.